Hi, everyone. It's exactly noon, so we're going to get started. Welcome to this East Coast lunchtime webinar on what are patient-centered outcomes and why aren't all health outcomes considered patient-centered. I want to welcome you on behalf of the National Health Council. We can go to our next slide, Silke. A few housekeeping items as we get started. This webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available. The recording will be available on the NHC website after. All attendees are automatically muted, so please submit your comments and your questions through the Q&A function. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, the National Health Council is a membership organization, and this is a snapshot of the logos of our patient advocacy group membership. We have about 64 patient advocacy groups that are in membership, and you can see they range from very large size groups to groups that represent smaller communities of rare disease patients and everything in between. Next slide, please. This webinar that we're doing today is part of a series of webinars that we've been doing for about 2 years now on topics related to patient-focused medical product development. And if you go to our website, you can see the recordings for all of these past webinars, and today's will be added to this list. At the bottom of this slide is the link for getting to this list, and that will be made available to you at the end of, these will be made available to you at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. So the speakers today include myself, Eleanor Perfetto, Executive Vice President for Strategic Initiatives with the National Health Council, and also Dr. Elizabeth Airline, Assistant Vice President for Research and Programs at the Council. Next slide, please. Here's a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to begin with some discussion of terminology and a little bit of historical context with regard to patient involvement in outcome measurement, selection, and development. We're going to talk a little bit about how continued use of legacy patient-reported outcome measures that may not be patient-centered could be a barrier to patient-centered decision-making. And we're going to provide some resources for evaluating the pedigree of outcome measures with a focus on the patient and patient centricity. Next slide, please. So why are we having this webinar? There is, of course, increasing interest in patient-centeredness across the healthcare ecosystem. We, of course, have seen that evolve in terms of research, especially research that's been sponsored by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute and work that's being done and encouraged by the Food and Drug Administration. We're seeing more patient-centeredness in healthcare delivery. We're seeing patient participation and centeredness in clinical practice guideline development, payment models, and quality measurement. So with that increase, we want to be sure that there's a good foundation that we're building upon, that everyone has a good understanding of what we mean when we say that a measure or an outcome that we are looking at is patient-centered. This outcome selection that happens in research and care has significant downstream implications, and that's why it's good that we have a good foundation built on. Next slide, please. So let's begin with a little bit of historical context. Next slide. It's over 20 years ago now that we've had the first introduction of the term patient-reported outcome and patient-reported outcome measure, when it was defined by folks at the FDA. And they said that they put out the definition of what a patient-reported outcome measure was. Prior to that, the language had predominantly focused on health-related quality of life. And you see HRQL as the acronym there. And so in that period of time between the years 2000 and the years 2010, there was this real shift in language from calling everything a health-related quality of life measure to calling it patient-reported outcomes. And shifting thinking in that a health-related quality of life measure is a type of patient-reported outcome. It's not the overall label, it's one type of measure. So the health-related harmonization group became the pro-harmonization group. The FDA put out a draft guidance on patient-reported outcomes. And then in 2009, there was a final FDA guidance document on patient-reported outcomes. In 2010, PCORI was established with a focus on patient centricity and patient engagement. And so you see that era from 2010 to 2020 really focusing on patient centricity and conducting patient engagement to get at patient-centered measures. The FDA, after PCORI was established, the FDA shortly thereafter started to focus on patient-focused drug development program. That was part of PDUFA 5. And then again, there was more in PDUFA 6 that happened later in that decade. There was the PCORI methodology report that talked about how to conduct patient engagement and how to ensure that research is patient-centered. And then, of course, with the recent PCORI reauthorization, they have an expanded mandate to really broaden the definition of what patient-reported outcomes are, what it includes. Next slide, please. So what is a patient-reported outcome? So you'll see here that this is a FDA NIH a group that's called the BEST working group, where it talks about biomarkers, endpoints, and other tools. And the best definition of a patient-reported outcome is a report that comes directly from the patient about the status of a patient's health condition without interpretation of the patient's response by anyone else, by a clinician or anyone else. It's done by self-report or by interview. It's usually about symptoms or other unobservable concepts only the patient can report on. And it talks about the patient's perspective on those concepts and on their function and their activities. These are things that can be observed by others, but in this instance, we're asking specifically the patient about those things. Next slide, please. So what is being patient-centered? Well, being patient-centered is any process, program, or decision that focuses on patients in which patients play an active role as meaningfully engaged participants. And the central goal, the central focus, is on optimizing the use of the information that patients provide. So getting at that information that comes from patient and optimizing its use in whatever that process, program, or decision might be. In summary, it's doing things with patients, not for patients or to patients, and it relies on meaningful patient engagement. Next slide, please. So when we talk about patient engagement, what are we talking about? We're talking about having a conversation with patients in the patient community about which are the concepts that are most important to them. What are those outcome concepts that are most important to them and that should be measured? What is the best way of collecting that information, the best data collection mode? How do we gather that information from patients in the most practical, most efficient way, low burden? How should the items be worded? Items just really refers to the questions. How should those questions be worded? Making sure that those questions are understandable. Making sure that patients are all interpreting the questions in the same way and that they don't have different interpretations based on the language that's being used. And is there a recall period appropriate? Is it appropriate for me to say in the last 24 hours, how have you felt versus the last week or the last month or the last year? How relevant is that recall period and what's the right one? And does the response scale make sense? So if I give you a choice of answers, slightly or moderately or excruciating or other kinds of modifiers, does that response scale that I'm asking you to pick from, does it make sense to the people who are answering those questions? And patient engagement is a mechanism for capturing information about how to do all of these things in the right way. Next slide, please. So what is a patient-centered outcome then? If patient centricity and being patient-centered means you have patients engaged and you're working with them to understand what's most important to them, then it's the outcomes reported by patients as important to them in the way that they experience a disease or a treatment for that disease. It's the things that can only be identified by patients, and it's the things that are really important to them and that they can tell you from their own experience. So a patient-centered outcome is something that's of high priority given the particular disease and the population. Next slide, please. This is backed by the PCORI method standards on patient-centered outcomes. In the standards RQ6, which is about measuring outcomes that people who represent the population of interest notice and care about. And you see, identify and include outcomes the population of interest notices and cares about, provide information that supports the selection of outcomes as meeting the criteria of patient-centered and relevant to the decision makers, such as patients and decision maker input from meetings, surveys, or published studies. So again, it's getting at how do you get that information about what patients really care about, what is really important to them. It has to be based on patient informants and people representative of the population of interest. Next slide, please. So we get to that question of what's the difference between patient-centered versus patient-reported? Patient-centered outcomes are the ones patients report as important to them. patient-reported outcomes are outcomes reported only by the patients on how they feel or function. It's something only they know. So when we mesh both of these together, we want to get at those patient-centered outcomes that patients report are important to them and that would only come from patients and therefore are a patient-reported outcome. It's that middle sweet spot that we're trying to get at. We want to ask patients the questions about the things that are important to them. Keep in mind, we ask patients lots of questions. And when they're in a healthcare scenario or in a research scenario, patients will answer those questions. It doesn't mean they're answering a question on something that's important to them. So even though the question may be answered by the patient, it's reported by the patient, it may not be patient-centered because it's not something that's important to that patient. On the other side of the coin, patients can tell you that something is important to them that might not necessarily be a patient-reported outcome. Next slide, please. So patient centricity in patient-reported outcome measures. In 2009, the FDA put out their PRO guidance document, and it repeatedly states in that document that patient input is critical for developing valid patient-reported outcome instruments. And here are some quotes. Without adequate documentation of patient input, a PRO instrument's content validity is likely to be questioned. If symptoms known to be common to the population that's being studied in a clinical trial are missing from a measure meant to capture important symptoms in that population, we will question the instrument's content validity. So that's something that's coming directly from that document. Now, many of you know that there are some new guidance documents being prepared by the FDA, and they're not all out and final yet. And when they are out and complete, they will most likely replace the 2009 document as an updated guidance. But you will notice if you take a look at those new guidance documents that are coming up or drafts of them, that this is still emphasized. It's emphasized that there must be patient input in order for there to be content validity. And that's still very, very important. And these new documents go as far as to say that that's not just true for patient-reported outcomes, it's true for all clinical outcome assessments. Next slide, please. So in the little gray box at the top is really more of the FDA's language about this topic. And so it talks about, does the instrument effectively measure the things that patients care about? That's essentially what that little box is asking. Does the patient-reported outcome measure that instrument, that tool that's being used? Does it effectively measure the things that patients care about? We need to ensure that the measure does reflect what's important to patients and that qualitative data are essential for establishing that content validity of the PRO. Next slide, please. So doesn't that mean that all PROs should be patient-centered? Well, yes, absolutely. Theoretically, yes, it does mean that. They should all be patient-centered. PROs should all measure what's most important to patients. However, there are some cautions here. Just some cautionary notes. Older PRO measures, some of them are still in use today. They may not have been developed with patient input. So we very often refer to these as legacy measures. They're older measures that maybe were developed 20, 30 or more years ago, and they were not developed with patient input. Then it's questionable about whether or not those are patient-centered. And one shouldn't assume that they are patient-centered, but you should understand how it was developed or how that tool might have been adapted in some way to focus on what's important to patients, because older measures can be and have been adapted to be sure that they are concentrating on what's important to patients, and they do have that content validity. But it is a caution to be sure that you're working with questionnaires and tools that have made that attempt to focus on what's important to patients if they are older measures and didn't start off that way. Next slide, please. So one more caution. There's the word validation, and this is a very loaded word. You very often will see the quote somewhere, we used a validated questionnaire. And so there's one thing that everyone should be very cautious about when saying that a questionnaire is validated, a patient-reported outcome tool has been validated. You have to remember that validation takes place in the context of use. And so the context of use is the situation in which the measure has been validated. So in this example, you'll see that it's talking about patients with acute bacterial exacerbation of chronic bronchitis when they have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And the concept of interest is it would be those symptoms. And the tool has been tested, but it was tested in outpatients who meet clinical trial entry criteria. And so this is not something that has been validated generally in a population of all COPD patients. It's only been validated in a specific population of COPD patients. And so there should be some caution in extending its use to groups that are outside that context of use. And so it's not safe to say that it's validated for all COPD patients because the testing has to be done to ensure that. And it's especially not safe to say that because it's been validated in this one use, it could be used in any population with a different disease. That's even more risky to be able to extend that term of validation to something outside this specific context. And so it's something to keep in mind, especially when older tools are being talked about and we refer to them as validated. You always have to ask second questions after that. Validated where, when, how, and in what population to really understand how it's been tested. It's really important to understand the testing of the questionnaire. Next slide, please. So we're going to shift now and go to some examples and implications, and I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, for setting it up. I wanted to go over in the coming slides some examples that I think will highlight a number of key takeaways for folks. The first one is that engaging patients can help us to create a better evidence base. Legacy measures, that is, measures developed without patient input, are still in use today, and this can have negative implications for patients, and it can have negative effects on the health system if we're not very clear about whether or not they're patient-centered. And then finally, I'll share some fairly simple questions that you can ask to ensure that any studies you are conducting or studies that you're evaluating include patient-centered outcomes. So I wanted to start off with this example of how patient engagement enhances measures. And so this is an example from the exact PRO, and I've linked the reference below. But you can see here that through additional qualitative research, the researchers were able to identify that indeed these outcomes or symptoms that are listed on the top, cough, sputum, difficulty breathing, those are really important to patients. And those are sort of a traditional symptom triad that's been measured previously. But what they also found was through their additional patient engagement work, they were able to identify a number of different symptoms as well as attributes that are also really important to patients. And so they were able to move forward with those particular symptoms and embed those into a patient-reported outcome measure. So if they hadn't conducted that additional focus group work, they would have been missing out on a lot of important aspects of a treatment to patients. Next slide, please. I also wanted to comment on whether patients really do need to be engaged if clinicians are engaged, because we see a lot of times that there are measures that have been developed by with clinician engagement or sometimes called expert engagement, but no patient engagement. And so I wanted to also note that it is really important, even if there is clinician engagement, that there should also be patient engagement because the perspectives can be quite different. So I've linked here to a study that was conducted by Axel Mühlbacher about how they did a lit review where they saw that among 46 studies that were comparing clinician preferences to patient preferences, actually most of those studies revealed that there was some disparity between the preferences of patients and those of physicians. And so it varies a little bit depending on the type of disease. It can vary depending on the setting, but by and large, we see that there are differences between what patients tell us are important and what healthcare providers tell us are important. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to show a couple of examples about why it's really important that as you are evaluating the evidence that you don't assume that patients were engaged in outcome selection or in PRO development. So these are just a couple of examples where researchers had conducted a literature review about a specific topic. And so these are assessments of patient-reported outcomes in various therapeutic areas. And so that means that they looked in the literature to see if they could identify all the different questionnaires or patient-reported outcomes that have been used in past research on a specific disease. And what you see here is that on the top left, these researchers looked at PROs that are used to assess chronic low back pain. They found actually only about half had any indication that patients were involved at all, and only 3 of the 13 that they found were validated with patients, were tested out with patients, as well as having patients contribute to identifying upfront those outcomes that were important to them. We see the same thing over here where this is in dysphagia, and we see here that less than half of them had patients involved in developing the item content through focus groups or interviews. And then we also see down here, this is in upper limb function and MS. Actually, no PROs described a process of patient or expert engagement to define the scope of the concept of interest, which means the outcomes that they were going to be looking at. And so these are just a couple of examples. There's many more that show that many of the PROs that are out there that have been used in past research really aren't having evidence that patients were involved in their development. Next slide, please. I also wanted to look at the question about our legacy measures still in use today. And so I thought that this was a really nice paper and a nice example about where this is the present pain intensity item of the McGill Pain Questionnaire. It was actually more than a decade ago now that this one had been flagged at an FDA meeting, as well as in a publication, that it was developed for clinician reporting and never underwent qualitative evaluation with patient input. If you take a look at what the question actually is, how strong is your pain? And then the response options are mild, discomforting, distressing, horrible, excruciating. It's fairly confusing to see actually what the difference between perhaps discomforting, distressing, horrible, or excruciating are. And so we can expect that if we were to ask patients to help us develop those items, we might have different response options. And so you would expect, because this had already been called out at an FDA meeting, this had already been published in Value in Health, commenting that this is a measure that really at least this item should not be used. It's confusing. It was developed without patient input, that we would see a reduction in its use. And there might have been a reduction, but when I did a quick search on clinicaltrials.gov yesterday, I found that in fact, 92 studies are using the McGill Pain Questionnaire, and those were just the ones that are actively recruiting today. I looked at the McGill Pain Questionnaire to see if it had been updated since, and what I found was the same response options actually as is listed here. Next slide, please. And so I want to call out that this really has broad implications across healthcare. I think that there's an understanding or a misunderstanding that patient-reported outcomes are often patient-centered, and that we're doing a much better job of capturing patient-centered outcomes, whether they're patient-reported or not. And this can have implications for anything that uses a systematic review or that relies on the clinical evidence base. And so I'll highlight just a couple of those examples on the next slide. So one of the areas where this becomes particularly important is when it comes to value or health technology assessment. And so this is when researchers look at what clinical trials have been conducted, what other information is out there about particular medical interventions. And many of them are really quite interested in having patients engaged in their process and using patient-centered outcomes. And what we see is, this is an example from the ICER Patient Participation Guide, where There's a lot of efforts now in order to develop evidence as part of a ICE review. We see this in other countries as well and at other agencies as well, where there will be some type of surveys done in parallel to an HTA. And this is because we find at the value assessment stage that we didn't collect the right evidence, or what patients tell us at that stage is important. It turns out that actually the outcomes in the trials or the outcomes that were used in even real world studies sometimes weren't the same ones that patients say are important. And so really, if we would do the earlier patient engagement, we wouldn't need to have these quick data collection through surveys during the course of a value assessment. We could have a more robust evidence base. Next slide. So in addition to seeing this with clinical outcomes, we also see this having an impact when it comes to cost effectiveness analysis, again, as part of value or health technology assessment. And so here you can see that really the patient perspective is not systematically included in economic models in value assessment. And that's because the measures or the health states, the different instruments that are used, don't identify how patients value a health state, and they don't, and they're often done using societal valuations. Not to mention, many of the tools weren't developed with patients. And so what we see here is that access decisions are based on data that doesn't necessarily reflect patient experiences or their priorities. Next slide, please. So now I wanted to provide just some guiding questions that I hope will be practical for folks who are interested in identifying patient-centered outcomes. So what can you look for as you're planning a study or as you're evaluating a study? Next slide. So here's just some that we've brainstormed based on our own past work, which are, did patients identify the concept of interest or outcome? If it's a patient-reported outcome, was cognitive interviewing mentioned? Are any of the best practices referenced? Can you find documentation describing development or testing of a measure? And then, were patients involved as test subjects only? Is there anything else about patient involvement? So I'll show through a couple of examples what this can look like. You can go to the next slide, please. So the first question is, did patients identify the concept of interest or outcome? So as you're starting a study and you go into PubMed or Embase and you're looking around for what's been used in the past, and you might be interested in using a patient-reported outcome, here's one of the things that you can be looking for, which is always going to be written if it has been done as part of the study. So this is just an example of the type of language that you might be looking for. Here you can see that it says on the top example, qualitative focus groups and individual interviews were used, they identified the outcomes that were most important from their perspectives. And so what that means is that patients were involved quite early on in development in order to identify what are those concepts of interest or what are the outcomes that are important to them. And then that was taken forward, and the measure was developed based on that information. Now you can see in the second example that in this particular study, actually, they don't reference that focus group or the individual interviews. Instead, what they had done in order to identify the concepts of interest or the outcomes is that they had done a lit review. And that's what they used in order to yield the symptoms that were brought forward. And so there's certainly nothing wrong with doing a lit review, and that's best practice, in fact, to identify what's been done in the past. But there was no reference to whether they had evaluated those critically for patient engagement. And then also, if you read the full paper, what you'll see is that these were largely taken forward without additional opportunity for patient input. Next slide, please. I also wanted to touch upon some that are not going to be necessarily measured via a patient-reported outcome to give a sense of where you might go to look for data And so here's some examples from FDA Voice of the Patient reports that are linked on the left-hand side. And the first one's about lung cancer. And so the patient input or the patient insights that were described during that meeting showed that when asked to discuss trade-offs, the majority appeared to value prolonging life above all other factors. And so what that indicates is that probably a survival outcome would be an appropriate, a patient-centered outcome in a study about lung cancer. Now, if we look at the next line, we can see this is from the Voice of the Patient report about hemophilia, as well as a number of other bleeding disorders. And so during that meeting, they stated that joint damage or pain were the most significant impacts on their loved ones' daily lives. And so in this particular case, a clinical measure might be a patient-centered measure because it would be joint damage, and patients have told us that that's important to them. And then pain would likely be measured with a patient-reported outcome. So both of those would be patient-centered outcomes in this particular example. And then here's another example from hereditary angioedema. And in this particular example, patients told us that actually diagnosis was the challenge, and that's something that was really bothersome to them. Most of the patients said that it took 10 years or greater for them to receive the correct diagnosis. And so in this particular example, time to diagnosis might be a patient-centered outcome. And so in that case, you can also imagine how patient-centered outcomes could be directly applied also in a real-world data type setting. Next slide, please. So now I wanted to show a couple of examples of now, if it's a patient-reported outcome, was cognitive interviewing mentioned? And so this is a really important step in terms of ensuring that measures are patient-centered, because it's really to make sure that patients can understand what they're being asked and that they are responding to the questions that you think that you're asking them. And so here's an example of a study where they're very clear about what their cognitive debriefing interviews look like. They ask patients to go through a draft version of the questionnaire and to talk about their understanding and then the ease of administration of that particular measure. And then here we see another example. In this case, this is one where they actually didn't do the cognitive interviews with patients. And so here you can see that actually a questionnaire was developed, and then it went straight into an eDelphi survey where they were, in this particular case, they were they were looking to folks to provide feedback on it, but they relied instead of on patients for feedback about whether it made sense. They actually just looked at PRO instruments that had been developed and were in use. Those other instruments were considered valid, reliable, and sensitive. And so they thought that just by using the same kind of models as those, that would be sufficient for ensuring patient understanding. And so really what we'd like to see here is that there should be an additional step where they're doing interviews with patients to make sure that the interviews are actually patient-friendly because patients understand what's being asked of them. Next slide, please. And then another quick way to sort of get a sense of whether this is a good measure is, our best practices cited. So here's just a couple of examples of best practices you might look for. Certainly FDA guidance, the PRO guidance that Eleanor mentioned, as well as the new PFDD guidances, the PCORI methodology statement, which has a lot of information about patient-centered outcomes, and then also other good practices. Here's just a couple of examples, but S4 has put out a lot of examples of what good looks like in these various contexts. So in some ways, this is a quick screen. Did the researchers reference these in terms of their development strategy? That can be helpful just first of all, and even being aware, did the researchers know that these resources exist? And then did they follow them as kind of a guiding practice for developing that particular measure? Next slide, please. And then the other ones that I wanted to highlight are, can you find documentation describing development or testing of a measure? This is perhaps a obvious question, but what we found in a study that we had done a couple years ago when we had been looking at a set of PRO measures where, the concept was described, but then it wasn't actually attached to that particular measure to a publication. We were trying to figure out what kind of measure, what measure does that relate to? What we found was that in many of the cases, we could find some kind of documentation, but in some cases, especially measures that were older, we couldn't find any documentation describing how they had been developed. And in some of those cases, it seems as if somebody had put together a table, said this is a questionnaire, and then gone with it. And it might sound ridiculous, but actually many of those have been broadly used. And so it is worthwhile to just take a minute if you're looking at any kind of measure that you're going to be embedding into a study, is do a quick search and see what you can find in terms of documentation describing development or testing of that particular measure. And then another piece is just take a look at the publication, if you can find documentation. Were patients involved as test subjects? That is, was a measure developed and then they're just being asked to test it out? Or was there other patient involvement perhaps? Examples might be that perhaps there's a patient advocate who's contributing as a co-author. And so there might be some additional work, there might be some supplemental materials, or there might be a patient registry that was leveraged to inform items or concepts that were used. So there are a variety of different ways that patients can get involved in this. And it's a good practice to just take a look and see what that looked like in that particular case. Next slide, please. So before we go to Q&A, just a quick keep in mind, a takeaway is that not all patient-reported outcomes are patient-centered, and not all patient-centered outcomes are patient-reported. So certainly PRO measures should be both, but you've seen that they aren't always both. Next slide. So we can take some questions through the Q&A function.
Elizabeth, we had one question that came through the chat that I think is a broader question that would be good for people to hear about. It says that the person questioning says that it's very common in some circumstances to conduct a Delphi type process for gathering information from patients, and that is can be quite labor intensive, resource intensive. So the question was, can pharma companies do all of this when they're launching so many new indications for products, especially for one product? And so it's a great question in that this is not just for a pharmaceutical company, but it could be just for anyone who wants to think about what's the best way to begin to collect data from patients on a particular condition for a specific population. And it doesn't always have to be a Delphi type assessment process. There are lots of ways of engaging patients and getting information from them. And before you even begin the Delphi process to figure out what kind of questions you'd put in front of the patients, or what kind of preference options or choice options you'd put in front of them, you want to begin by having some of those conversations. Those doesn't always have to happen that the company has to do that. Sometimes the information is out there existing and that others have collected the data in the past. And so you can find some existing data to build upon. It might come from a patient advocacy organization that might have a registry where they've been collecting data and reporting on that, or that there's that patient group that has been collecting survey data over time. And so that can be a starting point. Within companies, there are different divisions, of course, that have relationships with various kinds of external groups that you could reach out to and find out if they already have some of the data. So it doesn't always mean that you're starting de novo for every single indication, because there can be some existing data to build off of. And then there are lots of different mechanisms and means for conducting patient engagement. And of course, some of the resources that Elizabeth listed are things to turn to try to make this as an efficient process. And remember, it also needs to be efficient on the side of the patients and the patient groups too, because there are so many different companies working on particular indications. Any one company could be asked, any one patient group at any one time could be asked to be engaged by 10 pharmaceutical companies, and that can be very difficult. So keeping that burden down on the patient groups is also something to keep in mind too.
Just a couple of points I would add. We're starting to see more and more social media listening studies being published, and sometimes those can be really interesting. There's an interesting example about atrial fibrillation triggers, and that was a question that patients had, and then that was something that became the topic of that particular study. So social media certainly can be a source of some initial insights into what patients are thinking about, what's important to them. Certainly patient registries, voice of the patient reports. I also wanted to call attention to the website that Eleanor had pointed out earlier, the one with the links to the patient-focused medical product development webinars, because we had one of our members a couple years ago give a presentation about how her organization, the Alopecia Areata Foundation, was developing a patient-reported outcome measure, and they were developing it with a number of different pharma companies. And so the idea behind that was it would be efficient on the part of the patient organization, but then it's also more efficient for the company because they don't have to put all the funds for that one particular PRO forward. It's split. But then the other piece, which I think is really important for our conversation about decision-making and how this gets taken up into the health system, is that then you have one patient-reported outcome measure that gets used across studies. And that can be really important, because the other piece that we don't want is it turns out that there's 10 different PROs that have all been developed, and now we don't have comparisons across them because they're all slightly different in the way that they've been developed. And so really a nice example that I recommend folks take a look at.
We still have a couple more minutes before the end of the 45-minute session. So if there are any other questions. I think one of the things that we very often will see asked about some of the older measures out there is, the kind of, when you see the kinds of things, examples that Elizabeth brought up where patients maybe were not involved in the past, but that doesn't mean that those questionnaires are bad or can't be used. It just means that some additional work needs to be done to go to patients and run those questions by them, have those conversations, understand what's important to patients, to understand if those older questionnaires can be adapted and used for the purposes that you need. So I wouldn't say this is a situation of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This is a situation of, let's take a look at what's there. Let's hold that up against what patients tell us are important to them, and see whether or not those older instruments can be adapted in some way, fine-tuned, to be sure that they are capturing the information that's most important to patients. So this is not an all or nothing. It's a kind of a buyer beware. Take a look at the questionnaire and try to do your homework on whether or not it really is good and was developed with patient input. And if you find that it wasn't, you can always take the adaptation into consideration rather than throwing out and saying you have to start from scratch. I think one of the other things too, Elizabeth, that you might comment on is the use of instruments in terms of the different places where they get used. You mentioned value assessment and things like that. How not having a good grasp on how good the tool is early on in the research part has implications for how the data get used later.
Sure, happy to think about some of the other examples. I mean, one that comes to mind is, of course, clinical practice guidelines, because that's another process where it's reliant on a systematic review, where the researchers and the clinicians will look at what's been published. And so if the evidence base is filled with all kinds of data on outcomes that aren't important to patients, you run into kind of two different situations. The first one is that you run into a clinical practice guideline that just has a lot of information and recommendations based on things that patients don't care about. Or you run into the situation where patients are actually involved in the clinical practice guideline development, and then they say, oh, actually, these things are important to us. We should be thinking about these kinds of things as we're developing the guideline. And then you look in the literature and see, oh, but there's no corresponding evidence. And so you have a guideline that ends up with with all kinds of remarks about how there was insufficient evidence or the evidence rating is poor. And so that's another area where you routinely see this having a big impact. And of course, those guidelines have an impact on what patients receive. And so just see this across the board. Same thing in quality measurement, where we've got surveys of patients about their experiences in hospitals, across the board, and those also need to be developed with patients.
Right. Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our time. We want to thank you for your attention. As we said, this session has been recorded and it will be made available on the website. And we hope to see you again at one of our next webinars in patient-focused drug development. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.